what we've seen over the last 3 years in particular is when there's challenges in communities, the voluntary sector steps up.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. The Let's Imagine podcast has, to this point, focused on issues facing Canadian charities and nonprofits. Today, we're going to go global and hear perspectives from a counterpart organization, the National Council for Voluntary Organizations, or NCVO, that supports the sector in England. Over the past couple of years, an informal network of leaders from organizations like Imagine Canada and NCVO, the National Council of Nonprofits in the US, the Community Council of Australia, and others have been meeting to talk about a variety of issues, some that are unique to our respective countries and others that we share. Sarah Vibert, CEO of NCVO, has been a regular contributor to these conversations, and we're delighted that she's agreed to participate in this episode. Sarah, welcome. It's good to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Bruce. Thank you so much for having me on.
Great. Well, to kick off, we're going to chat about the differences and similarities facing charities and nonprofits in England and Canada. Having an international perspective on issues helps us to really broaden our own thinking. But before we kick it off, it would be great to get to know you a bit more. Sarah, perhaps we could start with your connections to charities and nonprofits. Tell us why, for you, the work of the voluntary sector is so important.
I guess put simply, because the voluntary sector is so embedded in our society, in our communities, in our everyday life. What we've seen over the last 3 years in particular is when there's challenges in communities, the voluntary sector steps up. We saw that happen through COVID. We're seeing that again now through the cost of living crisis. We're seeing the huge response of the voluntary sector to the war in Ukraine. And so I guess for me, I see charities, they're there for people at the absolute worst of times, but they're also there to bring communities together, make life better. So your scouts groups, your sport club, your community centre. And I guess, speaking very personally for a moment, there's something about that kind of community that charities create. I grew up with a disabled brother, and I remember really clearly as a teenager, the charities that my family accessed and got support from, and we were linked up with other families in a similar situation to ourselves. And I guess there's that kind of making you feel like you're not alone aspect of community building. And so, I guess it's just I think it's fascinating how embedded charities are in society. And also interesting how sometimes people don't even realise when something actually is a service delivered by a charity. So, for example, in the UK, if you call 999, you might get paramedic, ambulance who works for the National Health Service, or you might get somebody from St John Ambulance, which is a charity in the UK. And lots of people assume that, for example, hospices are almost entirely funded by government in the UK. They're not. They're much more funded by the public and by charities. And so, hopefully that's a good starter for the podcast.
Absolutely. It's interesting too, and I speak to people in our sector, how many of them, their origin story connects to their family. Even spoke to it here, but it's amazing how many people they've really started that introduction to the sector really came through their family. As we're partway through 2023, experts have been talking about the economic headwinds facing organizations in our sector. In England, the data suggests that times might even be tougher than in Canada. Andrew J. Scott, professor of economics at the London School of Business, underlined the origins of the cost of living crisis, which include a longer-term squeeze on the standard of living in the UK. He says, these are pretty deep-seated problems we've got. They're about long-term growth, structural trends around inequality, and now an adverse shift in the terms of trade due to higher energy prices, which may persist for some time. These seem like very fundamental long-term problems to deal with. From your perspective, what implications are you seeing in real time for your members and other nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that kind of long-term structural challenges, and we'll maybe come back and touch a bit more on that later on, Bruce. But in terms of the challenges, we're seeing kind of the cost of living crisis, or kind of more specifically, I guess, rising inflation, have this kind of triple whammy effect on charities. So firstly, declining income. And so the public in the UK are giving less. So they're either giving smaller amounts or they're cancelling their direct debits altogether. And then, of course, that income is not worth as much as it once was because of inflation. So if those organisations that have public sector contracts, those contracts are not being uplifted in line with inflation, which means that charities that were perhaps already subsidising those public contracts are now having to subsidise them even more, the bigger gap to fill. And their charitable income is down as well. So it's really, really tough for those organisations, particularly those delivering services alongside the public sector. And certainly we surveyed charities just before Christmas, and nearly half said that their financial position was expected to deteriorate in the next quarter, compared to a fifth, so 20% that said it would improve. So that kind of gives you a kind of sense of the scale, really. Alongside this declining income, we're seeing absolutely spiralling demand. And I mean, there's all sorts of different surveys that are showing this, but probably the starkest for me is, so Citizens Advice, which is a very large charity in the UK, which gives advice to people and communities on all sorts of things. And they do this monthly dashboard showing what the cost of living crisis is having on communities. And every month at the moment, they're reporting record referrals to charities, which just shows how much that demand is growing. And I think charities are having to make really difficult decisions. They're having to close their waiting list. They're having to turn people away, or they're having to compromise on the quality of their service so they can try and meet some of that demand. And then I guess the third area is increasing costs. And so we've heard from charities that have seen, anything between a 300 and 1,000% increase in their energy costs towards the end of 2022. So a large proportion of charities in the UK pay commercial energy costs, which are not capped. Domestic energy costs in the UK are capped. Commercial costs are not. The government did provide some support in the last quarter with commercial energy costs, but that scheme is coming to an end at the end of March. So from the 1st of April, there's going to be a lot less support from government for charities in paying energy bills. And I mean, quite simply, unlike a private business, you'll know this, Bruce, a charity can't just put their prices up to meet those rising costs. And it's not just about energy costs. Energy costs has been something we've focused on in terms of lobbying UK government, but we're also seeing staff costs rising, the cost of any supplies, paper, printing, all going up. So we've talked a lot about that kind of triple whammy, but I'd probably add a sort of fourth thing to that, actually, which is also the declining volunteers. So as well as cash resources, people resources. And I guess this is a longer term trend. It's not just about cost of living. We saw a lot of volunteers step away from volunteering during the pandemic, perhaps because they were shielding, or perhaps because the services they were supporting were not able to open because of social distancing. And a lot of those volunteers have not come back. And then I think cost of living is adding another layer. So, people understandably need to take on more paid work. So where they maybe they would have done, 3 volunteering shifts a week, they can only do 1 now. And so it's just another way that charities' resources are being squeezed. So, I mean, I'm painting quite a bleak picture, but what I would also add, though, is the UK voluntary sector is incredibly diverse, both in terms of the size, from, your tiny micro organisations to huge £100 million charities like Cancer Research UK and some of kind of the most famous charities in the country. They've also got very different business models. And I guess business model is key in terms of what the impact is and whether those income sources are being particularly squeezed at this point in time. And, what I always say about the voluntary sector is it's run by incredible people, innovative, creative people who will pivot their services. They will reinvent their organisation time and time again to respond to new needs. So I don't want to get too doom and gloom, but it is really tough. And of course, people want to help as well. We've got over 16 million people in the UK volunteered for a charity or another organisation last year. That's down on previous years, but that's still 16 million people who step up and want to help.
Yeah, Sarah, that's so interesting. I mean, many of the issues that we're seeing here are parallel. They're mirror issues that you're facing there. Maybe the degrees or scale of challenges might be different by subsector or by organization, but many, in fact, are the same, particularly this rising demand and cost squeeze that you mentioned. And the point that you made on volunteerism actually really takes us into the next part of the conversation that we wanted to have. Like here in Canada as well, we're seeing major changes to volunteering patterns. And you've noted that there's a similar effect is happening in England and the UK. We had noticed the Big Help Out campaign, and was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about it and how this effort is hoping to turn the tide and inspire more people to volunteer their time.
Sure. Yeah, delighted to talk about that. So as I just said in my kind of previous answer, our research is showing that the number of people volunteering for a charity or a club or a group has actually declined since 2018. It's the last time we did some research. And we absolutely need to change this. And so there's a group of some of the largest volunteer involving charities in the UK. So the Scouts, the Guides, the National Trust, the RSPCA have come together. There's 26 largest volunteer involving charities with another coalition called the Together Coalition, which involves lots of the big media outlets in the UK, as well as some of the faith groups and charities. And they came up with this idea of a public-facing campaign to really showcase the benefits of volunteering, not just to the communities, but also to the people who volunteer, with a long-term aim just to get more people to try volunteering for the first time, and particularly people who don't traditionally volunteer. So it's about both, I guess, the inclusivity of volunteering, but also the absolute number of people volunteering. We've got a big opportunity in the UK, which is that our new king will have his coronation on the 6th of May, and Monday the 8th of May is going to be an additional bank holiday in the UK. And so we're using that bank holiday and I guess the kind of publicity and celebration that will go with Coronation of the King to make Monday the 8th of May a national day of volunteering, or rather the Big Help Out. And so we're encouraging NCVO members and volunteering organisations right across the UK to hold taster sessions on the 8th of May so people can try volunteering for the first time, but also to use the publicity that we've generated around the campaign to try and engage people in longer term volunteering opportunities. So yeah, we're really excited about that. I think while we're on the kind of topic of kind of volunteering and how it's changing, the other major initiative that we're working on specifically in England as NCVO is a new 10-year vision for volunteering. So we recognise we need more volunteers, which is what the Big Help Out is trying to do, but we also recognise there's lots of other ways that volunteering is changing and should change to meet new needs in communities, to meet new needs of volunteers. And so we're really taking this kind of 10-year approach to how do we reimagine volunteering? How do we shift power in volunteering? How do we make volunteering more collaborative with communities? And we're doing that alongside the government and alongside a number of partners in England. And so, yeah, it feels like a really big year for volunteering in England.
That's amazing. And, earlier you referenced the sort of innovative nature of our sector. And there's a great example of looking at an existing event like the coronation of the king, which, let's face it, doesn't come along very often, and being able to, in a sense, embrace the momentum of that and bring the message of community and volunteering through that particular opportunity. So, but be interested to see how it goes. It sounds very exciting.
Absolutely. And I think, the coronation link, I think, is really interesting because His Majesty the King, has a long history of, I guess, service and working in communities. He's set up lots of charities. And so it seemed just a really nice link. And I know that Buckingham Palace are really excited about the opportunity to link the coronation to something that's very much embedded in communities.
Well, we're going to switch gears a little bit and go from talking about coronations and volunteerism to public policy, which I know is something that both of our organizations spend a lot of time on. And while both of our nations operate under a parliamentary system, there are real differences between how our respective sectors are regulated. In Canada, the Canada Revenue Agency, or CRA, is the arm of government that oversees the application of the rules that charities and nonprofit organizations must follow. In England, you work with the Charity Commission, an independent, non-ministerial government department that is accountable to Parliament. Can you tell us a bit about how that works, the Charity Commission? And do you see any benefits from having a structure that's not affiliated with the day-to-day workings and politics of government?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, the different systems that we work under. And I think it's really important to have our independent regulator and free from political independence. It's a really important underpinning of the Charity Commission it's England and Wales, our Charity Commission. And it's not just important for the charities, but I think it's really important for the public and for public trust in charities, which then has kind of implications for giving and donations from the public. And we know from research that charities are some of the most trusted institutions in the UK. I think after the NHS as probably the most trusted institution. So that public trust is really important too. But I think it's also important that we do have that room for parliamentary oversight in the Commission's work. So one of the really important roles that Parliament plays is in the appointment of the Charity Commission's chair. And I guess that system's perhaps been tested in recent years. And so the appointment of the Commission chair has coincided with at least a perception, I think, of an increased politicisation of the process. And as NCVO, we've really had to push back hard on when there's been ministerial comments, which we think have really crossed that line and had the potential to be damaging to the Commission's independence, because we hold that independence in really high regard. And so, we've always advocated as NCVO to enable that inclusive, transparent regulation and having that independent leadership that the Charity Commission plays. And I think it's really important that charities see their regulator as impartial and politically neutral, the same way charities must be politically neutral, and making sure that the Commission is, equipped with the resources and the expertise to assess complaints that are made about charities by the public. And I'm really clear that NCVO, as the charity membership body, and the Charity Commission have complementary but different roles. And at the moment, I'm really pleased to say we've got a really strong relationship with certainly at leadership level, with the current CEO and the current chair. But actually what's been brilliant is actually our operational teams are increasingly working collaboratively. So we run a help desk at NCVO for charities to call up and find out about anything to do with running a charity. It's mainly aimed at kind of smaller charities. And then, of course, the Charity Commission have a customer service helpline where, people can ring again for any aspect around kind of charity regulation, from kind of setting up right through to closing down. And increasingly, those two teams, so our help desk and the Commission's customer services team, are meeting and swapping notes. And we quite often cross-refer to each other. So we'll often get someone call us that actually needs to talk to the Commission. And we know that a lot of our referrals, including our membership referrals, come from the Charity Commission. So that relationship between us as the membership body and the Commission is really important as well. I think another really big challenge that we are experiencing, certainly as NCVO in England, is, I guess, how the relationship between the voluntary sector and government, particularly national government, is evolving. It's always been a complex relationship. We are a service provider. We work in partnership with the state. But increasingly, what I think we're seeing is our members are picking up a lot of services that used to be state-run services. And we see that at kind of a macro level. So more than 50% of the sector's income now comes from the public. And government is, as a source of our funding, is a less significant source than it used to be for the sector. And then as well as this service delivery role, we have this campaigning role. And certainly what we're seeing is there are MPs in Parliament who don't think charities should campaign and make comments like charities should stick to their knitting, they shouldn't dabble in politics. And that is quite a challenging environment, I guess, for our members to work in. And we're absolutely clear charities can and should campaign. The Charity Commission is really clear that charities should and can campaign. So it's an increasingly challenging relationship, and one that we as NCVO are constantly looking to kind of build and renew. Our members work right across Whitehall, right across government departments, and so we're looking to kind of build those multiple relationships, so we can create an environment which is kind of conducive for charities to be able to do their service delivery role, do their campaigning role.
And it's certainly an interesting issue. I know in Canada, we're working with a minority parliament here. So, of course, we're preparing for an election at any time, even though there is an agreement that should keep the current government in place until 2025. But to your point, it's ever changing, new players all the time, and it makes it important that we're able to react with speed to be able to ensure that organizations have their place in the public debate and public discourse.
Absolutely. And I think we're really clear that charities are a really important part of a healthy democracy. We're gearing up for a general election now in the UK. I mean, the date's not been announced, but there will be a general election most likely in the next 18 months. And so certainly what we're seeing from our members is starting to engage with the opposition parties, plan manifestos. So yeah, I mean, it should be an exciting period.
So we're going to look ahead a little bit. NCVO produced a 2023 trends report called The Road Ahead, and it looked at a number of areas that would greatly impact organizations this year. And it included things such as the cost of running an organization will rise, voluntary sector income will be at risk, less public sector income, and increasing demand from service users, points that you've raised earlier. Now that we're partway into the year, what are you noticing relating to these or any other emerging trends? And are there changes that you're recommending to government or corporations in England to address these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge continues to be the impact of the cost of living crisis on charities. You know, that increased cost, increased demand, falling income that we talked about earlier. And we're really clear that this isn't something that the sector alone can solve. There is a role for government here. And so we've been doing a lot of lobbying around energy costs, and we'll continue to do that. We're trying to be really kind of innovative here. We're looking at things like a social tariff, working with the energy companies, looking at energy efficiency and kind of blended finance, grants and loans to be able to fund those. So they're the sorts of ideas we're discussing with the government at the moment. But we're really clear there are some subsectors. So hospices is a good one. Women's refuges is another one that are significantly affected by rising energy costs. And we want the government to step in and support those subsectors soon, because we can just see how much pressure they're under. And then I guess the kind of slightly bigger issue, which relates to all of this, is that we need central government to properly fund our local government across England and the local authority so they can fund community services. Because what we're seeing is less funding flowing through to local government. So there's less money for services locally, which means less money around for contracts and things that charities are delivering, but also means charities are increasingly picking up locally and delivering services that used to be funded by local government and used to be delivered by local government. And we know that many charities that are running local authority services or local health services are subsidising those contracts with fundraised funding.
I think this is certainly one of the areas we have in common around ensuring that there is a long-term sustainable stream of what you might call core funding that would go through to organizations to make sure that they're present to be able to pick up the increased demand that's coming from their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the other message that we're very clear about is this is not all about the government. There are lots of things government can do. I've just highlighted some of the, I guess, big policy asks we have at the moment. But there's also a role for the public. We're saying to the public, if you can, donate money. If you can't donate money, consider donating your time. We've talked about volunteering. There's clearly a role for local businesses here too. But also, I think there's kind of increasing interest in the UK around the role of philanthropy and kind of wealthy individuals and the role they need to play, you know, perhaps compared to other countries in terms of the proportion of money that's given away to charities. And so, yeah, there's quite, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach to how do we solve the challenge of the cost of living crisis and the reduction of income in the voluntary sector. It's always very easy to focus on the money and the money alone. It's clearly a really big challenge. But I think some of the other interesting kind of trends and challenges, I think the digital trend, you know, we can't get away from that really. I think it's been a long-term trend in the sector in terms of moving things online. So whether that's fundraising online or delivering services online or running our organizations online. But of course, COVID accelerated all of that. And I think one of the things that we're clear on is that the sector needs to upskill to be able to do that. We surveyed organizations, I think it was over a year ago now, and 1 in 5 said the major barrier to being able to be more digital were staff and volunteer skills. So there's clearly a lot to do there. And I think there's all sorts of interesting aspects to this. I mean, we've already talked about the regulator, but there's a regulatory angle. The Charity Commission has just put out some guidance around social media in charities because it's increasingly a really important platform on which to fundraise and to communicate. But also, I guess, an area where charities can quite easily fall kind of the wrong side of charity regulation if they, for example, are saying something party political. And so that guidance is very much, I guess, a respond to how kind of the world has changed and the world in which charities operate are changing.
Yeah, the points that you raise, particularly around being more vibrant in the digital space, are some of the responses that we're seeing from sector organizations. And I know that part of our conversation today is really focused on trends that seem to be kind of gloomy. Here in Canada, however, we've noted some silver linings in the pandemic and inflationary clouds. Things like courageous conversations about new business models or mergers, new service delivery practices that are building on new technology, and a closer relationship with donors despite engaging online. From your vantage point, what do you see as some of these more hopeful signs or practices emerging from organizations in England and the UK?
Really similar, actually, Bruce. I think any challenge, any change is always an opportunity to do things differently, isn't it? And what happened through the kind of earlier phases of COVID was incredible in the things that we did that we just never thought were possible before, whether it was moving events online or, lots of different, completely changing business models. I know just us as NCVO, as our own charity, we've completely changed our business model and tried things that we'd never tried before. We used to provide all our training face to face. We now try to provide it all online, and we reach many more members because of that. I think it's forced us as a sector to really focus on impact. And I think as a kind of falling out of that has been driving charities to work more collaboratively around issues. Increasingly, I'm hearing sector leaders talking about being leaders of systems, so leaders of the mental health system. So not just about lots of different mental health charities, but how can they come together around the issue of mental health and what's their individual roles and collective roles in tackling that issue. I think the changing to funding has been really interesting. We've seen grant makers become very flexible through COVID, and they've done it again through cost of living in terms of kind of being able to be more flexible with how that funding can be spent, how the reporting is done. We also saw a lot more flexibility through local government. I think it's a bit of a mixed picture now as to whether everyone's gone back to how they used to be. But I know that certainly through COVID, the need to just respond quickly and in a crisis took away perhaps some of the bureaucracy around local government funding and meant charities could be more innovative, more responsive. And then I guess it's also kind of changed the way that we engage with government.
So one of the things I'm starting to hear about now is concerns around the hardening of the insurance market for charities and nonprofits, meaning either costs are going up dramatically and or there's just simply coverage is not becoming available. Are you seeing anything the same in your area?
I have to say, it's not something that I've necessarily heard, Bruce. But I'll tell you what I have heard, which is interesting and might be kind of symptomatic of similar things, is firstly, charities struggling to get bank accounts because they don't make any money for banks. And secondly, charities increasingly saying they're struggling to get people to audit or do their independent examination. I guess that's a similar theme, that they're seen as not big enough clients or profitable enough clients. And obviously that's got a huge regulatory challenge.
As we come to a close, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on connecting beyond borders. I know that on a regular basis, you connect with leaders of similar organizations in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. What have you seen as the real benefits of connecting with leaders in other jurisdictions?
Well, I mean, I guess we've seen some of it on the podcast today, really. It's just that kind of shared learning and the kind of ideas that it sparks and the innovation you sometimes get that comes from that. I've certainly seen that on the calls that we've both been on together, Bruce, over the last few years. And I mean, let's not also underestimate the peer support. We run quite unusual organizations, all of us. And so there's certainly something in kind of, oh no, it's not just me struggling with that. You're also struggling with that particular membership issue or linking with government and charities issue. You mentioned our partnership with what we call our sister councils across the UK. And that's really important. And I guess because of the kind of nature of the UK and the kind of 4 jurisdictions, and we've got shared members who may be UK wide, but will be a member of all 4 of us. And I think, it's enabled us to coordinate on some kind of major strategic issues right across the UK, whether it's the Volunteers Week is a major national campaign that we run together across the bodies. And we're increasingly talking around things like workforce and the paid workforce and what do we need to think about, given you could live anywhere in the UK now and work for any one of our organizations or members. But yeah, I think that shared learning is so valuable. And I think it'll just grow and grow as we get to know our organizations and our respective countries more and more. So I've really valued the kind of partnership and friendship.
And I know here at Imagine Canada, we've seen direct benefit in terms of thinking about an evolved membership model. I know at times we'll go and talk with our own federal government about what's happening in other jurisdictions and provide different approaches and perspectives. And then I know there was some joint mobilization when a major credit card company was looking at changing structures and fees that would directly impact our collective members, and being able to get people from around the world have that message brought to them resulted in a significant change. So I know we've found great value in it. So Sarah, I want to take the time to thank you for spending some of your very, very valuable hours with us today. So much appreciate it, and look forward to connecting again in the future.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.